Joining us for this second session in the afternoon panels. I'm honored to be joined today by Madelaine Tuininga, who you will see on the screen here to my left. She is a member of the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade, so an insider from the European Commission, which is particularly relevant regarding the European Union proposal that is on the table at the moment regarding forced labor, that I'm sure we'll get into. Serving as the head of the Trade and Sustainable Development Unit within DG Trade. With me to the left is Michael Stumo, who is the CEO of the Coalition for Prosperous America, which, amongst other things, is the organization that PSSI has cooperated with in releasing the list of 50 Chinese companies that are linked to forced labor. And then at the end of the table is Mr. Vanpeperstraete, who is the Senior Legal Advisor at the ECCHR's Business and Human Rights Program. Let's begin with a question to Madelaine Tuininga. Can you hear me okay before we begin? I apologize. Yes, I would be more than happy to hear some opening statements. Yes, Madelaine Tuininga, do you have an opening statement that you would wish to share with us?
Good afternoon, everybody. I really apologize that I can't be there in real life. I hope to meet at a future opportunity, but I'm very pleased that I can join you this way. Can you just tell me how long you want me to speak so that I meet your expectations with an opening statement? You just want 1 minute?
You feel free to elaborate a bit more. Maybe somewhere around 5 minutes would be enlightening.
So I understand that you're discussing here the forced labor ban, the proposal by the European Commission to introduce marketing prohibition on products made with forced labor. And I probably then highlight a couple of aspects on what's behind this and what we are targeting. 3 things to highlight, and then I wanted to say something about the legislation and the content and how the mechanism works. The first thing to underline is that this proposal is not self-standing. We do not believe that you can address forced labor by banning something. This is part of an overall strategy where more pieces of the puzzle come together, which include other types of legislation, but certainly also collaboration with third countries to address the root cause of forced labor. The second thing that is in the philosophy of tackling this is that it really requires, we're dealing with very complex supply chain issues, and it requires all actors to act, not only business, also governments and stakeholders. And the third thing I wanted to highlight is it's constantly, when you're dealing with complex supply chain issues, it's constantly a question of finding a balance. The first, the stick and the carrot, I think is the most noticeable one also in the public debate. Do you hit with a ban and then it's done and fixed? No, you will always need, ultimately we want to address the root cause, so you need to engage and you need to offer the opportunity to engage. And if you talk about a ban, we also believe, as you're dealing with complex supply chain issues, your main question throughout the discussions need to be, is it doable? Because in the end of the day, if you make an undoable legislation, it's not being put in practice and you don't solve anything. So it's very important to develop tools, and I'll come back to that, and keep the focus. So what are the big risks that you're trying to address? And where's the bigger fish? And then for this particular piece of legislation where we had a challenge to work through is due diligence on the one hand and a ban. These have different objectives, and how do you bring them together? So very briefly, why do we have this legislation? It was announced by the President of the European Commission in the State of the Union in 2021. Clearly embedded in an overall strategy that you can read more about in the Commission communication on trade for decent work. I probably don't need to say in this audience why we do it. Forced labor is a human rights violation. It's prohibited as one of the 4 ILO fundamental labor conventions. It affects 27.6 million people, an increasing number. and it is a global phenomenon, including in Europe. Briefly on the content. So I saw in previous exchanges that we had, it's important to underline this is a product legislation. It's not company legislation, it's a product legislation. So it is about EU manufactured products produced in the EU and marketed in the EU or exported, and imported products. And it is any product that is made wholly or in part of forced labor, which requires you to go through the supply chain, because it can be also a part that is embedded in an end product. The proposal is aligned with international standards that we find very important. So it follows the ILO conventions and definitions. As I said, it establishes a ban and not due diligence legislation. And in that sense, it complements existing EU initiatives. It is risk-based enforcement by member states' competent authorities. And what we also find important is that we give due consideration to SMEs. And if there are questions, I can get back to that. We found it very important, as I said, that the Commission takes a very strong coordinating role in coordinating with member states the implementation and enforcement, and develop tools for implementation. I highlight three. We will develop a public database with information on products and countries where there are risks of forced labor. We will establish a very lenient network for cooperation for the implementation with member states. There will be a forced labor product network and information and communication systems. And we will develop guidance for companies and competent authorities. And these will focus on due diligence, risk indicators, and publicly available information sources. Very briefly, the mechanism, and I think some of you here will know one system that currently is in place, which is in the US. So our system is different. We start with a couple of triggers that can get you in the phase one of reasonable suspicion. And these triggers are the database, submissions, and other information sources. At that moment, nothing happens with the product. This can open a preliminary phase that which, if that leads to a substantiated concern, only then an investigation starts. And in this preliminary phase, there is an information exchange with a company and competent authority on due diligence, and there will be a focus on risks and the competent authorities to look at the size and the quantity and the scale. But this is a space that we wanted to create for dialogue, and that there is an opportunity to clarify what has happened, and probably the guidelines that we are giving are going to be important here. Only if this leads to a substantiated concern, which is a slightly higher level of evidence, will an investigation be opened, which then is focused on evidence gathering. There's no reversal of the burden of proof, if you want. I don't like that word too much, because it looks as if investigation is static, and there's always a dynamic interplay between an operator and a competent authority. But ultimately, it is the competent authority who has to give the evidence of forced labor, which is balanced by what we call a non-cooperation clause. So if a company or a third country or a government in the EU is not cooperating with the competent authority in the enforcement, he or she can base the findings on what we call facts available. And facts available is as much as something that you find in the database. It's a very low threshold. So there's an interest in cooperating. If that leads to evidence that there's forced labor, there is a marketing prohibition and a withdrawal from the product from the market. So imagine I happen to have a blue pen. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, a blue pen. So imagine that this was the product that was identified to be made with forced labor. All these blue pens are prohibited from the EU market, from being marketed on the EU market, and have to be withdrawn from the market. So we are not busy with shipments. We are busy with the product. And then there's an order to dispose of the product. And then the last phase is enforcement in the EU and also at the EU border. I maybe leave it here so that I can leave space to see if there are questions.
Yeah, great.
Sorry, as a final point, this is a Commission proposal. That's important to underline. It's currently in co-legislation, as we call it. EU co-legislators are the Council and the European Parliament. Each of these need to make their positions, and they're working on it. Once they have their positions, there is a negotiation between the three institutions. It's the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission that will then discuss further. So I can't promise that this is the final form. There will be those who are more lenient to say we need more the stick, and there are those who are more lenient to say we need more the carrot.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate you going into the context surrounding the proposal. It's very true that it is not self-standing, and I'm looking forward to going into this greater context more, as well as ideally contrasting the European Commission proposal with, for example, the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the United States. And on that note, I would like to give the floor to Michael Stumo, who can elaborate on that, perhaps.
Thank you. I want to say a bit about the history of forced labor in the U.S. and get to today. I also want to highlight Elias's paper that's in the materials here. You may have seen, but Elias, his paper is in here. The second paragraph is where PSSI is calling for a legal prohibition on EU institutions and persons holding the securities of forced labor companies. The back page, I know we found in the U.S. with some of the funds, they say, well, we couldn't possibly know which companies are in forced labor. Well, we worked with PSSI and others and said, well, we'll do the work for you, and here's 50 of them to start. So in the back, you can see 50 companies. They're in railroads, pharmaceuticals, solar, textiles, farm products and machinery, consumer electronics, and the like. Could everybody hear what I just said? Do I need to hit rewind or something? Okay. So this is not new. It's new in that we have state-sponsored slavery, which is China. It's not, as Louisa said earlier, it's, looking the other way on slavery and forced labor that happens in the margins. This is state-sponsored. It's different than others. There have been attempts to jawbone and to engage and use diplomacy. Obviously, that has failed. In the history of forced labor, there's been a lot of lip service and motions toward regulation that look tough and strong and have been impotent. In the U.S. in the 1930s, the 1930 Trade Act says no products may come into the United States made in whole or in part through forced labor. That's 90 years ago. It was never used. Everyone said, for whatever reason, the Customs Department found it difficult to do the investigation. The lawyers hired by the importers were too smart, or there wasn't the political will, or just free trade is number one and everything else must fall in its path. It was never enforced. I've hired a guy from the past administration who tried to really up the use of this enforcement tool before the UFLPA, and they were ready to announce it, and it got quashed by the people above him. They couldn't do it. The politicos stopped it. We've had in every labor free trade agreement labor and environmental rules to increase labor rights in the world. There was a study, I was a panel participant 5 years ago at Harvard, where they studied all these trade agreements with labor rights provisions, and these are labor union types doing the studies across hundreds of agreements. They found there was no impact on labor rights from these provisions. We have Department of Labor in the United States, and they are bound to list countries that tolerate forced labor and what sectors under the guise, we will name them and shame them, and because of that shame, they will stop. Total failure. Nothing. We have a generalized system of preferences program in the U.S. where we give trade preferences to poor countries, 120 around the world. There are conditions that they can export to the U.S. tariff-free. We have the lowest tariffs in the world, but even those are waived. Part of those conditions are to treat your labor well and have no forced labor. Never enforced. We let them have the trade preferences anyway since the 1970s, under the view that more trade will build them a nice middle class. It did not, and they didn't enforce the labor. Even this past 2 weeks, we had a big debate about trade enforcement of Chinese subsidized solar panels coming into the U.S., bypassing prior tariffs and duties, finding subsidized solar. And of course, the Chinese solar is made with forced labor polysilicon, mostly from Xinjiang. And the Biden administration decided that it would interrupt the adjudicative process by which we would put tariffs on these forced labor trade cheating solar panels through Southeast Asia, made by CCP companies called Longi, Trina. Canadian Solar is actually Chinese, believe it or not, JA Solar. And Biden declared a climate emergency. Therefore, we must have the forced labor trade cheating Chinese solar panels. The Congress passed a resolution to overturn Biden, but they need a veto-proof majority, which they don't seem to have gotten. So even now, when it comes to state-sponsored forced labor, and through the whole process, they said, we don't like forced labor and we are tough on forced labor and it's against our law. It was bullshit. Can I say that in Prague? Is that okay? Throughout the years, we've given China normal trade relations status in the U.S. That means you get access to our low tariffs. Normal trade relations status means that you treat labor well and that you don't engage in slave labor. The president had always, before China's WTO entry, certified that they comply with the rules. We have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was enacted now to say, well, okay, let's do it more systematically. Remember, China doesn't balance things. They make a decision and they go 140%. And we in the West don't quite get that. We don't get that they don't do rule of law. It's all leverage and power. That's why we're years behind. The UFLPA gives you can get a list of companies with forced labor, based upon a reasonable suspicion, which is a good standard, which is not a high standard. Then you burden shift, and it's up to them to prove that they're okay. That's nice, but there are some loopholes they've gotten around with applicability, which I won't go into. It's a bunch of legal stuff, but even that needs some improvement. So it's had not a big effect on the U.S., even though it seems a bit good. We support it. My organization supported it. They always get around these things. It's astounding. They're getting around it. We did the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which means no companies can trade in our markets, this was in 2020, that don't comply with U.S. investor protection rules like disclosure of their internal records and material risks and that sort of thing for 3 years. And every U.S. company, European company that trades in the U.S. has to abide by it. But since 2013, China did not have to. And so the laws, because of an executive agreement, they thought, they got to go out because they won't turn over their records. because it's state secrets. It's a violation of national law for them to turn over CCP corporate records to foreign audit authorities. They got around that. Our financial regulators did a secret deal with China that they won't show us. It's not public. They won't show it to us. And they pretended to do an audit in Hong Kong, whereby a test view of audits where they all complied, and thus they're still in our markets. It is impossible for all the requirements of a public company audit to have been complied with in the same way that other companies did for investor protection under those circumstances, but we can't see it. They say, trust us, it's okay. So that's where we are now. My organization comes to this from a manufacturing perspective, not originally from human rights perspective. We're about competing with China and the rest of the world and building back industry in the United States and dealing with unfair trade practices, misaligned currencies, subsidies, that sort of thing. But it just so happens we have state-sponsored slave labor to compete with in China, which we are now getting into and joining with the human rights community. So we just need a simple decision, de-risk from China. It's easy to get them out of our capital markets. It's no downside. Norway's already done it. Several of our states have already done it. You're not going to lose anything. Boom, they're out. You're not funding them. That's what needs to be done. As to the good side, strategic de-risking over time, where you bring back the most significant goods for a while and then the others, and you basically stop funding the CCP because they can't live on internal money. They can't live on their internal consumption, their internal investment. They need the foreign capital markets and the foreign good markets to pay the bills. The U.S. is the one paying their bills. So that's where we need to go over time with strategic decoupling on goods. I've probably gone over my 5 minutes. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much. You do a brilliant job of just showing how spread and infused all of our major sectors, our economies are. You mentioned railroad, consumer electronics, solar, etc., where I think the breadth of this really cannot be understated. I also appreciate you going into or at least circling the potential difficulties of the EU legislation, but also the loopholes and inherent weaknesses perhaps in U.S. legislation, or you mentioned the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. So I'm really looking forward to diving into these perhaps weaknesses and looking into where legislation can be strengthened in both of our legislations. Mr. Vanpeperstraete.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much to the organizers for bringing us together here in this house. We at ECCHR, we look at indeed more from the human rights community. So in that sense, we also connect a bit with the discussion in the previous panel, like what are the values that we espouse, and forced labor, the fight against forced labor, against modern slavery, is indeed, according to us, but actually also according to the International Court of Justice, something that can trump other freedoms like free trade. And that's also something that even WTO recognizes. There's a good exception as long as it's not discriminatory to protect certain values, environment, but it could also be the fight against forced labor. So in that respect, we're happy to see that in, let's say, the last years, there's increased attention on what do we do with when forced labor happens somewhere else. Because at least within the European Union, we basically had to criminalize forced labor within all the member states. But what do you do in terms of fighting that beyond the borders of the European Union? We've tried a bit in our own litigation to use domestic legislation in France, Germany, the Netherlands, to use that criminalization and to apply that on corporate actors that source outside the EU products made by forced labor. Each jurisdiction is a bit differently, so it's often something about aiding and abetting such a crime as forced labor, or fencing, or in the Netherlands, where the legislators have foreseen that even just a mere profiting of forced labor or human trafficking would be sufficient. So that's the first set of litigations that we as the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights have done. In that sense, we're also very happy that the Commission has joined the increased global attention to look at products made by forced labor. We're very happy that the proposal is on the table for the co-legislators. And I think we share the concern that was voiced earlier that we need an instrument that is workable and that is an instrument that results in enforcement action. In that sense, we tend to look maybe a bit more to what the experience in the US is than the Commission itself, because that's a place where we've seen enforcement action, we've seen increased enforcement action, and we think that has to do with a number of reasons. One is the evidentiary standards. In the US, under the Tariff Act, it's reasonable but not conclusive, which we think is an appropriate standard for something such as forced labor, because forced labor often happens in zones where you don't readily have access to the material, to the evidence. I do take note that the Commission has a non-cooperation clause, but that's still something else as the evidentiary burden itself, because what do you then do if there is a form of cooperation? Then you go back to your evidentiary standards. And so in that sense, alignment with the US evidentiary standard seems to be something appropriate, especially if you see that in the vast majority of the enforcement actions in the US. So the US basically has two ways of enforcing, withhold release order or a finding, and it's that withhold release order that operates under the lower evidentiary standard of reasonable but not conclusive. And that's also really where we see the vast majority of enforcement. Out of 52 actions, I think 8 have been findings, but the rest WROs. So that's what that evidentiary standard does. If you remove that from the equation, you come to a much more limited scope of enforcement, and that's certainly a place where we would think that the EU proposal has room for improvement, and I think not unimportant, alignment as well, because it becomes a bit tricky if you have several jurisdictions, the US, nowadays also Canada, soon Mexico, and then the EU, all start banning products by forced labor, but use different standards to assess whether a product is made by forced labor. That seems as a good recipe for, on the one hand, more bureaucracy for multinational operating companies, but also for organizing forced labor leakage amongst those jurisdictions. The second element that we think could be improved is currently the enforcement lies with 27 competent authorities. We think, similar as in the US, that an EU layer to the enforcement, so Madelaine talked about a lean network. I think we would at least look at a much more thicker European structure of enforcement would be appropriate, especially in cases that civil society actors want to deposit information, because in the current EU proposal, people would deposit it at any of the 27 member states. Let's say we have information about forced labor, or people in the room have information about that. Which one would you choose? That's very unclear. Maybe the Belgian one will become very popular and overburdened, and the Luxembourgish one would not have one, or maybe the specific supply chain that you want to target is actually much more active in Spain, but you've actually filed your cases in the Polish competent authorities. So at least having a Europeanized, European-level entry point where you can deposit those complaints seems to be necessary. Secondly, what do you do if there's more complex investigations covering several countries in the EU, or where you need to do additional investigation in third countries? Let's say that you want to look at something that's happening in India. If Luxembourg knocks on the door to India, we want to actually have a bit more information, or the EU, I think that makes quite a significant difference. So also those more sensitive investigations, we see at least a role for the EU. And then thirdly, especially when it comes with regions, when forced labor is not contained to a specific production facility or a group of companies, as we've seen in some of the US enforcement, but much more regional, such as take forced labor in the cocoa sector in Côte d'Ivoire, or in situations where you have state-sponsored forced labor. We talk a lot about China, so China would be a logical place, but Uzbekistan, etc., are all constellations where you have the state who's actually organizing forced labor. At that moment in time, we think, again, it's maybe not the best approach to leave that to any of the member states, but a European collective approach to enforcement, the investigation, would make a lot of sense. So we at least see a clear case for more Europe in this investigative process. I've already mentioned it, but I think it serves to highlight that the current proposal really looks at specific supply chains. And so that means that, again, in those constellations where you have a regional problem, either culturally or the state is the main actor, at that moment in time, you do need to think in your enforcement actions beyond the narrow confines of individual supply chains. Otherwise, you'll just be repeating the same investigation over and over again. So that's something that we would want to be reflected much more clearly in the investigative processes, as well as the outcomes that would come out of that. A last element that I think is important to strengthen the proposal is also the whole discussion about traceability and disclosure of traceability data. Currently in the US, customs data is available for advocates. In the EU, it is not. And the EU is in that sense even an exception, because Canada, India, Brazil, they all release customs data. The EU currently does not. The EU is reforming the customs code, so maybe something will happen there, but that's something that we currently do not see, which is really important for any investigation, both from competent authorities as well as from civil society coming up with potential cases, to be able to link not only the place where forced labor occurs, but also to link it specifically with value chains leading into the European Union. So having a hook of publicly disclosed data and the underlying traceability is really important. And I think here it's really important to stress that that seems like a big ask. I find it a big ask, but it's an important ask. But it's also an ask that is, from a business perspective, easier and easier to do than even a couple of years ago. The technical advances in traceability of global supply chains has made such strides that currently today it's a very fair and reasonable ask to also strengthen not only the supply chain traceability, but also the public disclosure of that specific data. Maybe one last comment on process. Madelaine has mentioned that it's now with the co-legislators. We see the Parliament jumping with, I think, great enthusiasm on the file, which is good, which is something that we encourage. But currently we haven't seen the same enthusiasm in the Council. That's the place where this file is not necessarily taking all the speed, and so that's really something that does need to improve, and where I think, at least to the member states that currently are in the room, is a message to take home and discuss how to beef up speed and engagement at the level of the Council, because if we want to land this file, that's really the place where currently we would need to see a pickup of the pace. I'll leave it at here for a moment.
I think I counted 4, maybe 5 equally valid sort of pillars of how this legislation can be strengthened. In particular, I'd like to focus on the second one you mentioned, where you said that enforcement lies within each of the 27 member states, the national competent authorities, the police, right, or the customs authorities of each of these countries. And my question, I'll ask a quick question to Mrs. Tuininga. I would appreciate it if each and every one of you started thinking about potential questions of your own, and then ideally we'll have some time to get to as many of your questions as possible. Start putting those thinking caps on. Mrs. Tuininga, as you mentioned yourself, this legislation works with each of the individual national competent authorities. Is that not an inherent risk? Is that not adding multiple points of failure? How can we ensure that each member state, even the smallest and the ones with the least capital or resources available, that they do not prove to be the entry point for the entire common market.
So thank you very much. If you allow me, I also wanted to react to one other thing. So this is not the first piece of EU legislation. This is not an import ban. This is an internal marketing measure, an internal market measure. So it applies to EU-produced products, to imported products, to everything. Every piece of EU legislation, and I happen to be in charge of one of them, normally legislative pieces are with other DGs. We work with DG Grow on this. We are co-leads on this legislation. They do the marketing surveillance and have numerous points of legislation. This is the EU. The EU is composed of 27 member states, 27. The art is to bring that together and ensure coherence. The art is not to bring that at EU level. That is not going to make it more efficient. The knowledge is at the local level. So this is why I emphasize the tools. We're really from the outset and from the start will be investing in tools to ensure this coherence. So this network of member states, if one member state's competent authority has information, that will be discussed with the other member states. It's not that the Commission will not get that information actually, and there will be IT tools. So the question is more, how do you reinforce that than thinking that somebody in Brussels will be better placed to resolve this? So to assurances on that, and it is at local level, and it always happens. It so happens, if I look at the conflict mineral regulation, it so happens that in Germany you have significant more competent authorities in charge of enforcing this than in Estonia. That's what it happens, and maybe it's good. Maybe it's good because that's where most products with risks are traded and where you will develop most knowledge. But don't be, I think the message is no, these are not 27 isolated entities that are going to do it. The art is to bring them together, and that's why we have all these tools that should ensure coherence, and the Commission will not stand idle. I wanted to make one point on, and both of you have said it, on this idea that it is a good idea to copy in the EU the US legislation. I'm not criticizing the US legislation. In fact, we have an excellent collaboration with the US and are mutually learning from each other, but we have a different system. If somebody believes that on the basis of reasonable suspicion, which is a very low threshold, we can withhold products from the market, I would caution for that. It has quite a number of questions, not only legal certainty for companies, but it will put us also in a difficult position for guarantee for due process and avoid that decisions are challenged in court. Reasonable suspicion is a low threshold. It basically means if something is in a database or there's a complaint, you can withhold a product. So it is indeed the way the ban works in practice in the US, because it barely comes to findings, but it has a drawback. So I wanted to caution for that. On state-induced forced labor, I didn't mention the word, but of course that is a big part. It's not the only part. There's also a lot of other types of forced labor that we need to address. It's maybe a little bit more hidden how it is worked, but the non-cooperation clause that I mentioned is quite forceful, because you can take decisions on the facts available if there's no cooperation, which in the case of state-induced forced labor will likely be the case. It is also the case that in our future risk database, we will include information on risks in specific geographical areas that will be used by competent authorities to assess the possible breaches of the legislation. And as a third, now I become a little bit more technical, but the Commission may adopt delegated acts identifying certain products or product groups for which economic operators will need to provide additional information to customs authorities. And this additional information specifically relates also to all information up to the supply, the producers in the suppliers and producers in the supply chain. Sorry, I abused your question to answer some other points as well to which I wanted to react.
No, but if I can push you a little bit on this and start bringing up the topic of China. What is the feasibility of including China in a similar sense to the UFLPA does? And then if we can pivot to Michael, and if I could ask you, why is it important to include China? But if we start with Ms. Tuininga to answer that question.
So this is what I try to do. We don't make, this is not a country legislation. We have another regime. We have an EU sanction regime where we can target, it's a totally different, it's a human rights regime. It's a different regime, and we can target their, and actually we have listed also Chinese companies under that legislation, the EU sanction regime. But we have here, there's no need to sort of make it China specific. And the three elements I try to highlight is this non-cooperation clause. As I said, facts available. You don't need to go through any further burden than showing the facts available that you have forced labor. And this database that will include information on risks in specific geographical areas that will be used for the enforcement and the assessment of possible breaches. And the fact that we may adopt delegated acts to identify, that would identify certain products or product groups for which economic operators will need to provide additional information. If you want, this is deepening the burden of proof, if you want, because you will need to tell who was the operator, who was your supplier, and who was the economic, the producer throughout the supply chain to come to this product.
Mr. Stumo, did you have a note just on why mentioning China is important?
Mentioning China?
Include having legislation that specifically addresses China and in terms of forced labor.
Well, I've already laid out the long history of trial and failure with forced labor bans. So I think that history needs to be learned from rather than sort of midway. I do know reasonable suspicion standard, for what it's worth, is perfectly fine and lawful in the U.S. context. Actually, it was used relatively successfully when on the capital markets side, Roger mentioned Executive Order 13959. Is that the one, 13959? It doesn't matter, you don't care about the number, but it was a prior executive order, pretty new, which the Trump, and then it was later reiterated differently by Biden, said it was a capital markets ban. You couldn't invest in Chinese military companies or those involved in surveillance. It's significant because it was the first by the president weaponizing a list. We had a list of Chinese military companies, name and shame. Nobody paid attention, especially China, and said, well, okay, you're on the list. You don't get it, raise money in our financial markets. And that was reasonable suspicion standard there, and that holds up easily in our court system for what that's worth. And that was no U.S. person or entity may invest in one of those companies either in the U.S. or abroad. So you couldn't go to London and do it, or sort of some other place and do it. It's a nice model, actually, what should be used in part in any financial capital markets ban for Chinese companies going forward. There's lots of reasons: investor protection, national security, military companies, surveillance companies, and just plain old the fact that they're all arms of the state. If they're not arms of the state, they're not going to trade in the public markets, period. But on the forced labor side, it's very hard. Again, it's a different level. We're still talking about forced labor, slightly different point, as if it is company specific, and thus we're going to deal with the companies. And that's what all these prohibitions have been, and they're very investigative based, and it puts a large burden on the customs authorities or whatever the national authorities are. We see it in the U.S. with trade cases, anti-dumping, countervailing duty cases, forced labor cases, this and that, and it's just all whack-a-mole. They get one here, and then it's over here, and then over here, and over here, and you just can't keep up. We import $2.5 trillion worth of goods a year, trillion, not a B, You get 59 cases and it's probably what, you know, $10 million worth of goods or something. It's not even a hair on the elephant, it's a molecule on the hair on the elephant. So we can argue about it. I hope we do UFLPA, which is our Forced Labor Prevention Act, better the next time around. We're still not to the point where you need to address the government, not the company, because it is the motivating actor. We're very uncomfortable with that. But I think that's, you know, where we're probably going to go. We're somewhere now where we didn't think we'd be 4 years ago. In another 4 years, we'll be in a very different place again. I think that is a look into the future.
Absolutely, I cannot agree more, and I appreciate that you bring up capital markets. That's what I would like to pivot into now. Mr. Vanpeperstraete, from your perspective, do you consider capital market sanctions to be achievable from the European Union, at the European Union legislation level? And Mr. Tuininga, I would like to hear your thoughts on that answer.
Well, let me turn it first around. Because, okay, Madelaine said in the beginning it's a product-based instrument, but there is also an entity linked to it. It's always based at a company where something happens. And then you ban all of the products. So the purple pens that are in Madelaine's office, all of them will be banned if they come from the same supplier making forced labor. And you do that not necessarily because of the product. The pen didn't really do something bad, but you do want to exert leverage upon that factory to cease forced labor and to remediate the victims. That's the whole purpose. That's also what we've now seen increasingly happening in US enforcement. So from that perspective, it is indeed strange to say to an entity. We found, for example, a vacuum cleaner factory in Malaysia, just to take a case that has had some recent exposure, or masks, breathing masks, also produced in Malaysia, by the way. It's quite strange to say we just block the product, but we continue giving you access to financial instruments in our same jurisdiction. There is indeed a problem of consistency there. That being said, I think in the current, because okay, the EU is of course, as Madelaine said, a specific beast in the sense that it has a treaty and everything needs to derive from the treaty. I'm not sure that you will get a capital instrument approach under this treaty basis. I think you need to look something else. That being said, that could be a very nice next step. We'll probably, I haven't thought this through, but my inclination is that that would probably be a different instrument with a different treaty basis. And in that sense, respond also to what Madelaine said, that this instrument is not self-standing. So you can build boxes next to that. So once you have the product ban in place, that could be a next step of escalating. There is a bit of debate, I think, in Parliament whether to increase focus to services. The most logical one or the most visible one so far has been transport, because goods needs to be shipped, and the US statute talks about the goods as well as the vessels. So that's an easy enlargement of the scope. Again, capital markets, maybe we need to study that a bit better. So I think the question is whether it's feasible within this instrument, but whether it makes sense as a whole of government approach, there I would totally agree that that's the way forward.
Thank you. Mrs. Tuininga, do you have a response or reaction to that?
No, this legislation, we've really tried to design it as focused as possible. There's always a risk of making yet another Christmas tree. among the instruments, and it's a very challenging instrument already. We're doing unprecedented database that we've said that we are doing, not loose from the legislation, but connected to the legislation. That in itself already is quite something. With all the tools and other things that are necessary, we really wanted to stay close to the ILO definition and focus this on a product. That said, we're discussing this only, but the EU has really a lot of legislation in place, and let's not oversee that. There's in place a non-financial reporting directive, but in the pipeline, CSDDD, the Sustainable Corporate Governance Due Diligence Initiative, which in the end of the day also covers certainly forced labor, being a human right, and these pieces of legislation will need to work together. So, I mean, I think in the US there may be this high focus on the ban because that's the piece of legislation that is there. But let's not forget that in the EU we're having quite a number of pieces of legislation that also address company behaviors and companies. So that's different from CSDDD. With deforestation, we have conflict mineral regulation with the batteries coming up. So there's quite a scope. For the rest, I know that there's a discussion in co-legislation on CSDDD, including its scope. So that would be part of another discussion. But indeed, this is a product ban, this legislation.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Stumo, do you have a response or reaction?
I'll take on the role of questioner maybe here, if I may. This corporate governance legislation, which I don't know anything about, part of the issue with the Chinese companies that are, carrying out the will of the CCP globally, they don't disclose. There's a lot of investor protection gaps. Do you, knowing nothing but what you just mentioned about the corporate governance legislation, do you sense that there are opportunities with it to make material disclosures of risks, material disclosures of forced labor, disclosures of accounting, investor protection, national security issues that they would have to show in order to be traded or in the EU or invested in by EU citizens? Is any of that relevant, do you think, to the legislation you mentioned?
Sorry, Mrs. Tuininga.
I missed half of the question, but I guess so. Maybe I can get help in the answer. But I mean, CSDDD is not finalized.
Can I re-ask, since you missed it? I'm sorry, I didn't speak into the mic very well. Do you think that legislation is a vehicle for investor protection, like material disclosures of risk, disclosures of forced labor, disclosures of, or that could require full public corporate accounting, just like EU companies? Do you have an opinion as to whether that legislation could touch on those factors which are troubling with Chinese companies?
No, so it is obligations on EU operators. And there are two pieces of legislation. We have the successor of the non-financial reporting directive. So if you want the sort of public information that needs to be disclosed on your reporting, on your due diligence, is in that legislation. And then you have the CSDDD. These are the two vehicles.
Great. Yeah.
Maybe I can add a bit to that. I think both the CSRD, the reporting legislation, as well as the CSDDD, the behavioral legislation, I think we need to clarify that those apply to big companies. So CSRD has an estimated coverage of, I think, 50 or 60,000 companies. There's roughly 20 million companies in the EU, so it's a piece of legislation for a narrow subset of companies. The import ban would be neutrally, or we hope at least, neutrally applied to all companies, because we look at whether or not forced labor takes place in the value chain, independent of whether it's a small company or a big company that imports it. That being said, CSRD and CSDDD operate in such a way that it does apply to I don't know about CSRD, but the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive would apply to companies also outside of the EU if they meet specifically with the thresholds. So if you realize, and this will depend on what the co-legislators decide, if you realize a certain amount of volume on the internal market, at that moment in time, you will become under scope of the obligation. So that, I think, is a very valuable hook, that it's not only limited to companies domiciled in the EU.
Thank you. We're nearing, we have approximately 15 minutes left, so I would like to open up the floor to any potential questions from the audience, if we have any. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, and I would like to ask a distinguished panelist questions about European companies that solely rely on China on their supply chain. We have established that many European companies have chosen to go with the path of reliance and short-term gain before the resilience in the long and mid-term. And I would like to ask you, how do we communicate to those companies that they should be geopolitically aware? And also, how do we communicate to them that China has not two separate workforces? For example, European EV market is completely reliant on Chinese mined lithium. It would be foolish to believe that China has two workforces, one for EU market, which is ethically sourced, and one for emerging market, which is not, and they don't care about it. It would be plainly idiotic to think so. So how do we communicate to them that they should prioritize these long-term visions and long-term stability rather than their short-term financial gain, and they should obey by their own rules and perhaps listen to the reports of intelligence agencies, and they do know where the minerals and this parts of their cars, parts of their labor is sourced from, and it's not sourced ethically. How do we communicate this, and how do we enforce it? Thank you.
Great, thank you very, very much. Do we have any initial remarks? Mrs. Tuininga?
No, thank you very much for these pertinent and important questions. I think there are several aspects to your question. My first would actually be, I remember vividly finding ourselves in the COVID era. And when we were getting out of that, actually the first thing we did is reconnect with our network, which is to a large extent an international network around responsible business conduct and all these questions. And throughout that time, where supply chains were significantly disrupted because of the emergency, the health emergency in which we were, but what came out was quite interesting in the sense that companies that had invested as a long-term strategy in sustainability were facing and coping better with these disruptions than others. I found that very interesting because I don't think that up to that moment we had seen that it is actually a strategic interest to invest in sustainability. I hope those companies have learned from it. But how can we make that clear? I mean, I hope that what has come out of the pipeline in Brussels over the last 5 to 10 years is clear in that respect. We do public consultations, legislation is published. What companies will see, and it's true that CSDDD applies to big companies, but big companies have small companies as suppliers. So the requirements to ensure the sustainable supply chain will be passed on from big companies to small companies. So I think the moment that all of this becomes mandatory, there will be a shift, and you see that happening now more and more. In the terms of forced labor, I think what is important, and that's what we are also keen to do and we are doing, is it is important to collaborate internationally. We work very closely with the US and Canada We work in the context of the G7, but also within the ILO and OECD. So that is also another important angle, certainly because, I mean, ultimately, we don't want that forced labor perpetuate. So we want to avoid that other markets are then created to go to. I mean, if a company, if as a company you would, as a last point, company solely relying on one country, that's a big company risk. It will not, our answer will not be, sorry, you rely on one country, we'll keep a close eye on forced labor or other violations of human rights. I mean, that's not a tradable. So and we're facing that discussion in a couple of products, like it is happening in the US, where there's a reliance on certain products in China, which pose a problem, and that will need to be resolved.
Yeah, Mr. Vanpeperstraete.
But not by non-application of a legislation.
Yeah. So under the due diligence obligation, companies would need to stay engaged, look at their risks, and try to solve them. Yeah.
Mrs. Tuininga, are you with us? We seem to have lost your video. Are you here in audio form?
My video got out. I'm trying to reconnect the video, but I hear.
Absolutely no concerns. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
I was already worrying if that was so offensive to talk about due diligence. But so you need to stay engaged. But in some contexts, it's impossible to seek meaningful improvements by an engagement strategy. And when, for example, the state is not protecting its citizens, at that moment you need to disengage. And that's really where this forced labor import ban comes, to help companies also make that decision to disengage. So I think that's the first step of it, to start putting a legal framework under that. But I think your question also looks at maybe the aggregate step, rather than looking company by company. You want to have some sort of direction. And this is, I think, really where the database could help. Like I think it's a positive step. I've been criticizing the proposal by the Commission, but I think the integration of the database into the instrument is really a good step forward. That's something that doesn't happen in the US, where you do have similar databases, and here it's aligned to enforcement. But I think the next step, and then we really come to your question, would be to indeed have a bit more of an industrial strategy, pinpointing also to economic actors, well, okay, this is the direction of travel, lithium or other materials or other products can be sourced there, or we will need to start finding refineries there, etc., etc. I think there's an attempt into that, into the Critical Raw Materials Act, but whether it's really responsive to your the scale at what you're hoping, that is maybe not necessarily aligned on the ambition level.
When you said, how do you convince who?
I would say, how do you convince the boards of the companies that do trade
The companies.
China, that rely on China geopolitically? How do we convince them?
You pass a law. The companies will maximize profit consistent with the law. Caveat that if they see risk, for example, investment risk that makes a difference on location of production, that became clear with the U.S. permanent normal trade relations status with China, where it was annual before. Normal trade relations means China gets access to our lowest tariff category. And as I mentioned before, that was annually reviewed, where it could have been pulled every year. It just wasn't, because we pretended they were complying with the law. But when it was permanent and they joined the WTO, everybody knew those low tariffs aren't going away. We can go invest there and have cheap labor and then re-export to the wealthiest consumer market in the world. And that was, from our perspective, a pretty big disaster for our production base in the U.S. Now, with the former president's tariffs on China with 301 and China's doing its own agitation, shifting from hide your capabilities and bide your time to wolf, diplomacy, sort of beating, more revealing, and of course the forced labor. Now we know that a lot of companies are thinking, the long-term future isn't there, we'll invest somewhere else. Some of it has been back to the U.S., more of it than not has been to third countries, and plenty of it stays in China. So I'd say pass a law, number one. Number two, some serious but not fake signal of future investment risk as far as location or production.
Great, thank you very much. I absolutely agree. Like you said, if the long-term future is not there, it's best to invest somewhere else. I think at this day has really been focused quite a lot on how we best try and approach just investor protection, or protecting our own civilians, or our own citizens, or just making sure that our own populations are not exposing themselves to financing forced labor or financing human rights abuses. And the thing about trying to protect your own citizens or your own domestic companies, rather, is I think it's quite clear to say that in the long term, having a continued trade with authoritarian regimes, having a continued trade with regimes which completely fail to live up to the most basic standards of free and fair economic relationships, it will not be in our best interest in the long term. And I think it's quite clear that writing is on the wall. But so just to have some concluding remarks, we're ending this panel just a touch early because we started it just a touch early. I think it's become quite clear that this piece of legislation can be seen as a sort of a first step, right? Either you put it into a context of it's not a standalone product, it's not the end-all be-all. Other legislation exists alongside it, and it's been said there is ample room for strengthening it and improving it. And what I've really appreciated about today is just the fact that I found that we have so much common ground, and that we're so able to really be laser focused on how we best strengthen these articles of legislation. And I think something that I would just like to mention, just in terms of, you mentioned looking into the human rights element of the European Union, and whether or not the legislation, whether or not the bite lives up to the bark, or whether or not the legislation lives up to the values that the European Union espouses or claims to stand for. One interesting aspect about capital markets is, if you look at capital markets sanctions, or capital markets based legislation, compared to trying to target the companies themselves, compared to trying to, or rather the company's operations, right? Compared to saying, no, you can't produce this anymore, we're going to shut down these factories. What does that do for the workers in these factories? If we completely ban them from, say, importing their products, which is absolutely a good thing, but if you compare it to in capital markets sanctions, who are you really targeting there? Who are the stakeholders in owning this equity, right? It would be the CEO, right? It would be the board. It would be these major stakeholders. With capital markets, it's really quite laser focused on the stakeholders that have more to lose, and the stakeholders who are the ones who are ultimately making those fateful decisions. The stakeholders that have, to a greater extent, blood on their hands when it comes to the owners of these companies. So I think that's an important sort of final point, perhaps, to leave on. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Mr. Robinson has some final remarks that he would like to leave us with. And on that note, I would like to thank you to all of you for attending this panel and for attending the panels today. And yeah, thank you very much.
In the way of a goodbye, I want to thank you, Madame Tuininga, for your presence today, and thank everyone again for attending. This has been a remarkable session. One thing to keep in mind, because you'll see a lot of it in the United States in 2023 and 2024, I can assure you, is an expansion of capital market sanctions, very much in the direction of human rights and national security related offenses, but also the investor protection issue that is so woefully lacking in the case of China. And I just observe again that there's never been the use of capital market sanctions, to my knowledge, in Europe. This is not something that has been a tool developed, despite the fact that I think it's the most powerful non-military lever or source of leverage available to us that strikes fear in the hearts of the Chinese. It could be a difference maker or a showstopper in terms of their willingness to engage in a much more meaningful dialogue on human rights. But it's certainly a big subject. I hope we've had a chance to introduce it effectively by discussing the U.S. track record in this regard and what we're hopeful of in Europe as well, in the spirit of alliance cooperation and the multiplier effect, the force multiplier that would represent for us. So we hope that this has been a edifying session for those of us that care about this, but also those that are administering it now. And that's why, again, we're so grateful for you being here. So once again, thanks so much for all of your attendance, and we hope it was a rich, worthwhile day. Cheers.